Sage Hamilton, and I would like to give you some historical background on slavery before we start the play. I would like to begin by dedicating my speech to the memory of Maya Angelou, the celebrated poet, novelist, educator, historian, and civil rights activist who passed away 1 week ago today. Her contributions will never be forgotten. I begin with the poem Slave Auction by civil rights activist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. The sale began. Young girls were there, defenseless in their wretchedness, whose stifled sobs of deep despair revealed their anguish and distress. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold, unheeded rose their bitter cries, while tyrants bartered them for gold. And women, with her love and truth, for these in sable forms made well, gazed on the husband of her youth, with anguish none may paint or tell. And men, whose sole crime was their hue, the impress of their Maker's hand, and frail and shrinking children too, were gathered in that mournful band. Ye who have laid your love to rest, and wept above their lifeless clay, know not the anguish of that breast, whose loved are rudely torn away. Ye may not know how desolate our bosoms rudely forced to part, and how a dull and heavy weight will press the life drops from the heart. When explorers came to Africa, they thought the Africans were a less intelligent version of humans. Those explorers believed that if they were as unintelligent as they thought, they'd be a great resource to bring back and use as slave labor. The explorers later learned that the only way to make them do what they wanted was by using brute force. They went to unknown African tribes and brutally attacked them, beat them, chained them up, and hauled the Africans to their boats. When the explorers ransacked their villages, they found some gold and thought the Africans must be rich, so they stole all the gold and valuables they could find. The Africans were forced to leave their homes with nothing. The explorers took everyone, women, men, children, and even babies. The Africans were made to leave their religions behind as well. The explorers took different tribes of Africans, and each one had a different language, so they could not communicate between tribes. The Africans were packed into wooden ships and given very little food or water, and chained up away from anyone they knew. Families were frequently split apart, never to see their loved ones again. The Africans had never been exposed to the explorers' illnesses, causing many slaves to catch unknown diseases, and many died. Others became seasick and malnourished, and many died from the poor conditions. To avoid a life of slavery, some of the Africans killed themselves aboard the ships. After the ships docked, the slave traders would put the slaves on a platform and force them to look happy, strong, and energetic, so the buyers would be more likely to purchase the slaves. Many times, the slaves were forced to stand on the platforms naked so their bodies could be fully inspected by prospective buyers. If a slave was purchased, the new owner, referred to as the slave's master, would chain up the slave and take him or her home. If a slave was not purchased, the slave merchants would punish them by beating them or depriving them of food. If a slave would become wounded or sick, the slave owners did not care. However, if the slave owner's cow got sick or hurt, he would find an animal doctor so the cow would not die. Slaves were treated worse than livestock, because livestock was necessary for survival, whereas a servant or slave was not. Slaves were not even considered human beings and had absolutely no rights. Some countries had their whole system based around slavery. This became more common after the Americans won the Revolutionary War. None of the Loyalists knew how to farm because the Loyalists and British soldiers thought that farming was for the lower class. Therefore, the work was given to the slaves. When the Revolutionary War started, the slaves did hope they could join the British and be freed. When the slave owners found out, they made stricter laws about slavery and were crueler to the slaves so they would lose hope. And the main reason slavery became so common was the amount of money plantation owners could make by having the slaves do all the work. Many owners became incredibly rich because of all the free labor provided by the slaves. Many businesses started booming with their increased production, and slavery became even more popular, leading many explorers to become slave catchers to fill the demand. Soon, around 3/4 of the country's population was made up of slaves. With many slave owners having large numbers of slaves, more of the slaves became rebellious, creating a stricter system. Many slaves were treated harshly and punished for their actions by being severely beaten, whipped, burned, and starved. The first serious slave rebellion occurred in 1663, almost 50 years after the first African slaves were sold in Virginia. Although most of the revolts were unsuccessful, slaves began escaping in increasing numbers, due in the most part to the establishment of the Underground Railroad by Isaac Hopper in 1790. Contrary to its name, the Underground Railroad was neither underground or a railroad. It got its name because of the railroad terms they used and the fact that it took place in the dark and in secret. Routes of escape were known as lines. The places where people would hide them were called stations, and the people, conductors. Slaves themselves were called packages or freight. The Underground Railroad went through 14 northern states and led to Canada. Slaves headed to Canada because they were not even safe in the north after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was passed, allowing the authorities and fugitive slave hunters to capture escaped slaves and return them to their owners. The most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad was an escaped slave named Harriet Tubman, who traveled back to the South 19 times and helped around 300 slaves escape. The North and the South became divided regarding slavery, the North being against slavery and the South wanting to keep slavery. This conflict resulted in the Civil War in 1861 when several slave states seceded and formed the Confederacy. The war lasted 4 years and cost over 600,000 lives. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which made ending slavery a war goal. It proclaimed the freedom of slaves, but did not outlaw slavery, though it led many slaves to escape their masters and flee north to gain freedom. The Underground Railroad remained active during the Civil War, and Harriet Tubman became an armed scout and spy. She was the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war, the Combahee River Raid, which liberated more than 700 slaves in South Carolina. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln proposed a constitutional amendment that would outlaw slavery. 13th Amendment finally passed in 1865 and abolished slavery in the United States. Before we begin our play, I would like to leave you with this quote from President Lincoln. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom of the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. Other means may succeed, this could not fail. The way is plain, peaceful, generous, just. A way which, if followed, the world will forever applaud and God must forever bless. Thank you and enjoy our play.